Hi. Thank you for attending today's reading. Let's begin. Try to scare me with your snake? Bring on the Christmas pettiness. This happened when I was 15. Me, female, and my sister were living with our dad near the south coast in Australia at the time. That Christmas we spent with my dad's sister and her kids, Jay 17 and Ray 13. For the week before Christmas until New Year's. Me and my sister grew up around Jay and Ray and got along great with them, so we were excited to spend Christmas with them. And our aunt lived on the beach, so that made it even better. When we arrived, we did the customary, "Hello. Great to see you. How are you? I haven't seen you in forever," yada yada introductions. It was a 3-hour car ride to get there, and the south coast at Christmas time is hot as balls outside. So we were grateful to be out of the car and inside with the aircon. Ray left to go to his room and I thought nothing of it. Until he came back, walked up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, with an evil smile on his face, "Look what I got for Christmas." Wrapped around his hand and shoulder was an impressively sized python. Ray stepped forward, holding his snake out to me, and asked, "You wanna hold it?" And by the look on his face I could tell that he was intending for me to be scared of the snake. But here's the thing. I grew up in the country and have avoided my share of brown snakes and red belly blacks. So needless to say, a baby python was nothing. Me, with a huge smile on my face. "OMG, that's awesome." Yes. Quote. Ray had the most disappointed look on his face as he handed his snake over for me to hold. That wasn't the first time he tried to scare me or pull a prank on me. And up until that point, I'd never retaliated. 'Tis the season to be petty. The next day we went into town and I bought what I needed to enact my revenge. No animals or reptiles were harmed in the making of this post. Ray loved his reptiles. He owned bearded dragons and had owned other reptiles when he was younger. But he was deathly afraid of one reptile in particular: frogs. I bought a motion-activated garden ornament that made a ribbit noise every time you went past it. The next morning, before anyone else was out of bed, I snuck into Ray's room to plant the frog. He's a heavy sleeper and I knew he'd be out until at least lunchtime. So I had no concern about being caught. I wedged it in his cupboard in a place I knew would be hard to find. Well enough hidden that it couldn't be seen, but open enough that the motion detector would still work. His cupboard was right next to his door, so the frog would go off every time he went to leave his bedroom. I set it in place, switched it on and went back to bed. At around 11 a.m. I heard a loud squeal from Ray's room, followed by the sound of something being thrown against a wall. With the best concerned voice I could muster, I knocked on his door. "Me. Ray. It's me. Are you okay? Can I come in?" Quote. Ray. "There's a damn frog in my room." Quote. I went in to investigate and offered to help to look for it. My aunt came in to ask what the matter was and chuckled to herself when we told her, and she walked out of the room. She's not a bad mum. Far from it. She'd come to offer her help eventually. After she had her morning coffee, I offered to help look for it, which inevitably meant I looked while Ray sat on his bed watching. Perfect. I subtly switched the motion sensor off while I looked for the frog. But of course, I couldn't find it. I left the room and waited for Ray to get into the shower before I snuck back into his room to switch it back on. Ray spent the rest of the day in the lounge room, refusing to go back into his room out of fear of the frog he heard again after he got back to his room. I waited until after dinner when I went back into his room. grabbed the frog and went back out into the lounge room. With an evil smile on my face and, with frog in hand, said, "Look what I got for Christmas. You wanna hold it?" Quote. The look of shock on his face was priceless as he realized what I'd done. Merry Frogmas. End of story. Next story. The two 18-year-old men who went missing on Hill 677. I was 17 years old when I was sent to Europe to fight the Germans in 1945. I really wanted more than anything to be involved in the war. I was from a small rural town in Nova Scotia, Canada, where the only things I knew was poverty and boredom. So I did everything possible to join the war. I was sent over in February of 1945 and Germany surrendered in May of 1945. I only got a small taste of what war was like, even though I was put with the elite Canadian Special Forces, also known as the Devil's Brigade. The only time I shot my rifle was during boot camp training. It was still exciting and it felt like I became a man overnight when I took my first steps in Germany. After the war, I remained in the Canadian Reserves more or less to get a monthly paycheck. I would have never thought that Canada would be thrusted into another conflict after the devastation of World War II. But I was dead wrong. I remember reading the newspaper headlines of a possible conflict in the Koreas. I really wanted no part of it. I had a very small taste of war and I didn't want any more of it. However, the Canadian government had other plans for me and they sent me to Korea in 1951. There was no fanfare or luster like there was for World War II. In addition to being in the Army Reserves, I had a good job with the Canadian National Railway where I had a young wife and a nice house. When I got the deployment letter, all I could think about was living in a tent with horrible food. It was actually much worse than I thought it would be. This time at 23 years old. I was the elder surrounded by young kids. I remember there were two 18-year-old Canadians who looked as fierce as puppy dogs. The one kid's name was Stan Murphy and the other was Charles Johnson. They were both from the same province of Nova Scotia as me. Though I didn't know them before the Korean War. With my 3 months of World War II experience, I was considered the hardened veteran. We were stationed on a hill in Kapyong known as Hill 677. One night we were thrown into heavy fighting with the North Koreans and the Chinese armies. I remembered continuously yelling at Stan and Charles to keep shooting. The enemy seemed to have an endless supply of men to throw at us. To this day, every time I watch a zombie movie, I get flashbacks. Because like the zombies, the enemy would continually come at us. As the onslaught continued, I had my bayonet affixed to my rifle. The enemy would run right into our machine guns. They just wouldn't withdraw. They had breached our line and I thrusted my bayonet into the torsos of 3 different enemy combatants. There was no training that could have prepared me for the sheer horror of that night. We killed hundreds if not thousands of them and we were considered victorious. As daylight came, I was so exhausted that I could barely move and there was no rejoicing for me because both Charles and Stan were missing. I was happy to be alive, but I felt like a complete failure. I let the wolves get the 2 sheep. I searched for hours for them after the enemy retreated. The last time I saw them they were both alive. They were no more than 50 yards from me to my left. It just didn't make sense and it haunted me for years because I couldn't get past the inevitable conclusion that the 2 of them were probably taken by the enemy. I heard horror stories after the war what happened to captured Canadians and all I could think was, hopefully they were executed quickly. Every day I relived the horrors of that night. So much so that I decided that the only way I was going to get closure was if I went back to Korea and tried to find out for myself what happened to those two young guys. I felt I could do more on my own than relying on the government bureaucracy. I inherited my father's gift of gab since I was a young child, and even with my limited ability to speak Korean, I had made some personal connections with a few of the South Koreans who fought alongside us during the war. I had kept in touch with one of the Korean soldiers named Sunbaek Kim via letters over the years. He had actually become the governor of the Gyeonggi province, where the Battle of Kapyong was fought. Sunbaek later learned that the retreating North Korean army may had taken South Korean captors to Pyongyang to be tortured. He didn't hear any rumors of Canadians being taken as prisoners. But I thought to myself, if they took South Koreans, then why wouldn't they have taken Canadians? Sunbaek told me he would discuss it more with me when I arrived in South Korea because he didn't feel comfortable writing about Stan and Charles. I decided to take the costly flight in 1995. With the layovers and everything else, it took me 45 hours to get from Halifax to the Gyeonggi province. I was greeted by Sunbaek at the small Gyeonggi airport. Fortunately, his English had improved since the last time I saw him in the early 1950s, especially considering I haven't heard the Korean language since the war. We hugged each other like we were brothers who hadn't seen each other in over 40 years. He took me to see the Battle of Kapyong Memorial Statue. I started crying immediately when I saw Hill 677. Though the hill was nothing more than overgrown vegetation, I could still remember the dead bodies being strewn everywhere in 1951. Sunbaek took me to his house where I met his entire family, to include his wife and kids and even his parents. When his family went to sleep, him and I sat at his dining room table to discuss the current situation. He told me that the South Koreans have spies in North Korea that even the Canadians and Americans don't know about. He told me he was willing to help me sneak across the North Korean border and we would be disguised as North Korean peasants. Being 5 foot 8 inches tall was a disadvantage because most of the North Koreans' males were really short from being malnourished. I had red hair and looked like the poster child for a Caucasian, so my whole head had to be concealed in peasant garbs and I had to keep my head down the whole time. We would go along with 2 other South Koreans guides who knew the way to get into North Korea, and they had connection there as well. We would walk to the outskirts of Pyongyang, North Korea, from the Gyeonggi province, which was about 50 miles. It is late October and the weather is in the 30 degrees Fahrenheit at night. It took us 5 days to traverse the Korean hills. We had a lot of supplies we were carrying with us, which were mostly bribes that were going to be used to get us across the border and then hopefully used to get additional information on the fate of Charles and Stan. I could see a remote North Korean guard station. There were signs posted everywhere warning that anyone who unlawfully passes the border would be executed. The signs really scared the crap out of me. I did think of the possibility that I was unknowingly being sold to the North Koreans. However, at this point there was no turning around. The 2 guides gave one of the guards in charge nearly 10 pounds of chocolate, which was considered an absolute delicacy in North Korea considering the country was so poor. Sunbaek told me that if the guards knew I was Canadian, then they would without a doubt take me as a prisoner because they would be considered utmost heroes for capturing a mortal enemy. We purposely put about 30 yards between us and the guards as I crossed the North Korean border, and I kept my head down the whole time. Luckily, I made it past the guard station. There were 3 guards who were much more interested in the chocolate than watching us pass the border. We walked another 10 miles to an unknown village. The 2 guides had our agent spy contact in the village. We met the North Korean spy in an old abandoned hut in the unknown village. It was something right out of the movies. I was both nervous beyond belief and excited as well. The 2 South Korean guides gave the spy 5 Dell laptop computers which were impossible to get in North Korea. Each laptop had classified information on them as well. Sunbake told me the spy would need a week to try to get information about the demise of Charles and Stan. The 4 of us stayed in the abandoned hut for the week. It wasn't heated, so I was cold during the day and even colder at night. Sunbake and I killed time by reminiscing about the war and the aftermath. This is the 7th day and the spy hasn't returned. We are starting to get concerned if the spy is coming back. You never know for sure if the spy is a double agent, and at any time we could be taken away by the North Korean army. The 2 guides assure us and tell Sunbake in Korean to wait 2 more days. It had to be about 3 a.m. on the 9th day. When the spy came into the abandoned hut, he talked to the 3 other men and Sunbake translated what he said for me. Sunbake said, he was able to find information about your missing comrades who disappeared in 1951. I respond, oh, really, what did he find out? Quote, Sunbake replied, our secret agent has photos that he got from a family in a village on the other side of Pyongyang. I responded, that's crazy, and then the agent took out the photos. Sunbake then said, these black and white photos are them in the 1950s. I almost fainted when I saw the photograph. They looked thin and emaciated. But at least they were alive. The agent pulled out more photos and gave more information which Sunbake translated. The 2 men endured insufferable cruelty for a decade. Then in the mid-1960s the dictator allowed the men to assimilate in a small village. This is highly unusual and the reason for this is unknown. The agent spy took out more photos which showed the 2 men having female partners. I was absolutely amazed at what I was seeing. But nothing prepared for what I saw next, which were photos of the 2 men's children. I kept saying, oh my gosh, over and over again. Based on the photos it looked like Stan had 1 daughter and Charles had 2 sons. The kids looked of mixed race, where the Korean features were more dominant. In a low somber tone Sunbake said, unfortunately, the 2 men had died in the late 1980s. They both had liver and other problems from years of severe malnourishment when they were held captive by the North Korean army. My mind was on a roller coaster of emotions. Part of me was saddened to hear of their deaths and another part of me was happy to hear they actually lived and actually had children. I wasn't allowed to take the photos. If this information made the national news, then Stan's and Charles's kids and whatever family he made here in North Korea would be executed by the dictator. We waited for sunrise and we started the trek back towards South Korea. I felt a sense of relief that I finally got closure on the 2 young men who vanished on Hill 677. One night in 1951. The walk back was effortless, partly because we had less weight we were carrying because we had given away our bribes, and also I was constantly in thought about how much my life has changed after being stationed here during the war. We made it back to South Korea, then the next morning I went to the airport to return home. I was beyond grateful to Sunbake, the 2 guides and the agent for the help and assistance they had given me. I knew there was one last thing I had to do when I got back home. Charles's mother was still alive and both of Stan's parents were still alive. The three of them were elderly and were living close to Halifax. I had to convince them not to share the story with anyone for fear of their grandchildren's lives. I figured the right thing to do was to give closure to Charles and Stan's living parents and tell them of their son's demise. Both of them were still considered missing in action. To be honest, it was beyond my wildest beliefs Stan and Charles had actually survived that night and lived up to the late 1980s. I told the parents on 2 different occasions, and on first meeting with Charles' mother she was so shell-shocked with glee that she was speechless when I left, which was the same for both of Stan's parents, which I met the next day. I had never seen anyone so shocked when I told their parents. It was like the part of their brains that had been closed off with despair for so many years was finally awaken with news the three of them never would have expected. I find myself now coming to grips with my experiences on the hill in Kapyong known as Hill 677. I will never be normal, but at least I'm a little less haunted by the disappearances of the 2 young men on one night in 1951. End of story. That is all for today. If you want to support my automated channel, feel free to drop a like and subscribe. See you tomorrow.